The old stagecoach bounced and rattled down the dusty trail, each bump making Eleanor's stomach lurch with worry. She pressed her face against the small window, watching the endless stretch of brown land roll by. This was nothing like the green hills and neat brick houses of Boston. Out here, everything looked wild and empty. Eleanor clutched her small leather bag tighter. Inside were all her belongings, 2 plain dresses, her mother's Bible, and a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon. Those letters had brought her here across half the country, to marry a man she'd never met face to face. Thomas Brennan had written such lovely things. He told her about his general store, how well his business was doing, how he needed a good wife to help him build a life in the growing town of Cedar Falls. His letters made her feel wanted for the first time in years. Back home, her own family treated her like a burden. Too quiet, they said, too scared of her own shadow. The stagecoach driver called out, "Cedar Falls, miss." "End of the line?" Eleanor's hand shook as she smoothed down her best dress. It was a soft blue color that brought out her eyes, though it was getting worn at the edges. She'd saved every penny. For months to afford this journey, there was no going back now. The door swung open, and harsh sunlight hit her face. She squinted, trying to see the town that would be her new home. Cedar Falls wasn't much to look at, just a main street with wooden buildings lined up like crooked teeth. Dust swirled everywhere, and the air smelled of horses and something she couldn't name. "Need help with that bag, miss?" The driver was already climbing down, ready to move on to his next stop. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely heard. Over the noise of the street, a group of men outside the saloon were laughing loudly at something. Their rough voices made her jump. She stood on the wooden sidewalk, looking around with wide eyes. Everything was so different from the quiet streets of Boston. Here, people moved with purpose, their faces hardened by sun and wind. Women hurried by in practical dresses, their hair covered against the dust. Children ran between the buildings, their clothes dirty from play. Eleanor felt completely out of place in her carefully ironed dress and clean shoes. She looked like what she was, a city girl who had no idea what frontier life really meant. The general store stood right in front of her, with Brennan's goods painted across the front window. This was it. This was where she would meet the man who would be her husband. Her heart hammered so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor pushed open the heavy door. A little bell jingled overhead, announcing her arrival. The store smelled of coffee, leather, and soap. Shelves lined the walls, packed with everything from flour sacks to farming tools. It was bigger than she'd expected and clearly doing good business. A tall man behind the counter looked up at the sound of the bell. He had dark hair and sharp features, dressed in a clean white shirt and vest. This had to be Thomas. Eleanor had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was here, she couldn't seem to move her feet. "Can I help you?" Thomas asked, not recognizing her yet. His voice was different than she'd imagined, colder somehow. "I am Eleanor Whitmore," she managed to say, though her voice came out as barely a whisper. "From Boston? You, ... you sent for me." Thomas stared at her for a long moment. His expression changed from confusion to disappointment so quickly that Eleanor felt her heart sink into her shoes. This wasn't the warm welcome she'd dreamed about during all those long hours on the stagecoach. "You're the mail-order bride?" Thomas's voice carried across the store loud enough for everyone to hear. Several customers turned to stare. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She nodded, unable to speak. Thomas walked around the counter, looking her up and down like she was a piece of merchandise he was thinking about buying. His frown deepened with each second. "You're much smaller than I expected," he said bluntly, and pale. "You look like a strong wind could blow you over." Eleanor tried to straighten her shoulders, but she felt herself shrinking under his critical gaze. The other people in the store were watching now, their conversations dying away as they realized what was happening. I can work hard," Eleanor said quietly. "I helped my aunt with her boarding house back home. I know how to cook and clean and keep books." Thomas shook his head slowly. "This is frontier life, miss. We need women who can handle real work. Birthing calves, hauling water, defending the homestead if need be. Look at yourself, you're trembling just standing here in my store." True, Eleanor couldn't stop her hands from shaking. But it wasn't fear of hard work that scared her. It was the way Thomas was looking at her. Like she was already a failure. An older woman near the fabric section clucked her tongue sympathetically. A bearded man by the tool display shook his head and went back to examining a hammer. Eleanor felt like a specimen in a jar, something curious and unfortunate for people to gawk at. "I made a mistake," Thomas announced to the room. His voice was final, like a judge giving a sentence. "This woman is far too delicate for frontier life, too timid. I cannot possibly marry someone who looks ready to faint at the first sign of trouble." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. She'd traveled so far, given up everything, and now she was being rejected in front of a store full of strangers. Tears stung her eyes, but she fought them back. She wouldn't give these people the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "But I have nowhere to go," she said, her voice barely audible. "I used all my money for the journey." Thomas shrugged, already turning away. "That's not my problem. I advertised for a frontier wife, not a hothouse flower." The bell jingled again as the store door opened. A woman in a dark dress entered. Carrying a basket, she took one look at the scene and hurried over to Eleanor. "What's going on here?" the woman asked, her voice kind but firm. "Mrs. Henderson," Thomas said with false politeness. "This is the bride I sent for. As you can see, she's completely unsuitable for frontier life." Mrs. Henderson looked at Eleanor. With gentle eyes, she was the preacher's wife. Eleanor would learn later, and she had a gift for seeing beyond surface appearances. "Child, what's your name?" Mrs. Henderson asked softly.
Whitmore, ma'am."
Eleanor managed to reply. "Well, Eleanor, it seems you've had a difficult journey. Why don't you come with me? We'll figure out what to do next." Eleanor nodded gratefully. At least someone was showing her kindness. As Mrs. Henderson guided her toward the door, Eleanor could hear the whispers starting behind them. "Poor thing, she really does look fragile." What was Brennan thinking? Ordering a bride like that? She'd never last a week out here? The words followed Eleanor out onto the street. She'd come to Cedar Falls with such hope, dreaming of a new life and a husband who would appreciate her gentle nature. Instead, she was already labeled as a failure before she'd even had a chance to prove herself. But as Mrs. Henderson led her down the dusty street toward the boarding house, Eleanor made a quiet promise to herself. She might be timid, and she might be different from the rough frontier women these people expected. Somehow, she would find a way to make a life here, even if it wasn't the life she'd originally planned. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Despite everything that had gone wrong, Eleanor found the sight beautiful. Maybe there was hope for her in this wild place after all. Jacob Morrison stood in the shadows near the back of Brennan's store, watching the whole sorry scene unfold. He'd come to town for supplies, but now he couldn't take his eyes off the young woman being humiliated in front of half the town. Most folks called him Bear on account of his size and the thick beard that covered most of his face. But right now, he felt anything but fierce. The woman, Eleanor. She'd said her name was, stood there taking Brennan's cruel words like they were physical blows. But Jacob noticed something others missed. Even with tears threatening to spill from her green eyes, she kept her chin up. Even when her hands shook, she didn't run or beg. There was something strong about her that had nothing to do with muscle or loud voices. Jacob knew about being unwanted. After his wife Mary died to Winter's back, he'd become the town's awkward widower. People either pitied him or avoided him altogether. He lived alone on his homestead 5 miles outside town, speaking to his animals more than 2 people most days. But watching Eleanor's quiet dignity in the face of such public shame stirred something in him he thought had died with Mary. As Mrs. Henderson led Eleanor away, Jacob caught a glimpse of the girl's face. She wasn't crying, though she had every right to. Instead, she looked determined, like she was making some kind of promise to herself. Most people would have crumbled under that kind of rejection, but Eleanor was still standing. Jacob waited until the store cleared out before approaching Brennan's counter. The merchant was already back to his business, acting like nothing had happened. "That was a cruel thing you did," Jacob said quietly. his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. Brennan looked up, clearly not expecting criticism. I can't help it if she's not what I ordered. Look at her. She's weak as a kitten. One hard winter would kill her. Maybe, Jacob said, picking up a sack of flour and hefting it onto his shoulder. Or maybe you just don't know what real strength looks like. He paid for his supplies and left without another word, but his mind was churning. That evening, he sat on his porch watching the sunset and thinking about Eleanor's face. Mary had been strong in the obvious ways. She could milk cows, chop wood, and shoot a rifle better than most men. But she'd also been gentle, kind, and had a way of making even the hardest days feel manageable. Maybe strength came in different forms. The next morning, Jacob rode into town earlier than usual. He hitched his horse outside the boarding house where Mrs. Henderson had taken Eleanor. Through the window, he could see the two women working together in the kitchen, Lenora's small hands kneading bread dough, while Mrs. Henderson tended the stove. Morning Bear called out Pete Williams from across the street. Heard about that bride situation yesterday? Quite a spectacle. Jacob just nodded and headed into Murphy's saloon. The morning crowd was already gossiping about Eleanor, and none of it was kind. Poor thing, looks like she'd faint if a mouse ran across her path, laughed one of the cowboys. Brennan was smart to send her packing, added another. Can you imagine? Her trying to run a frontier household? Jacob nursed his coffee and listened to the cruel jokes. Each comment made his jaw tighten a little more. These men had no idea what it took to cross half the country alone, to leave everything familiar behind for the hope of a new life. Eleanor had more courage in her little finger than most of them had in their whole bodies. When he finished his drink, Jacob walked over to the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson answered his knock, her eyebrows rising in surprise. Jacob Morrison, what brings you to town so early? Wondered if you might need any help with things, he said awkwardly. Jacob had never been good with words, especially around women. Mrs. Henderson's knowing smile told him she understood exactly what he meant. Well, I could use some firewood chopped, and the front steps need fixing. I'd be happy to pay for the work. No need for payment, Jacob said quickly. It's just being neighborly. As he worked on the steps, Jacob could hear soft voices from inside the house. Eleanor was helping Mrs. Henderson with the washing, her gentle tone mixing with the older woman's more robust voice. When the screen door opened and Eleanor stepped onto the porch to shake out a rug, she jumped slightly at seeing him there. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone was, ... She started, then stopped, recognizing him from the store. You were there? Yesterday, Jacob nodded, suddenly feeling tongue-tied. Up close, Eleanor was prettier than he'd first thought. Her brown hair caught the morning light, and those green eyes were sharp with intelligence, despite her obvious shyness. I'm Jacob Morrison, he said, standing up from his work. Most folks call me Bear. Eleanor Whitmore, she replied softly. Thank you for what you said to Mr. Brennan yesterday. I heard you defending me. Jacob felt heat rise in his cheeks. Wasn't right how he treated you. They stood there in awkward silence for a moment. Eleanor clutched the rug to her chest like a shield, but she didn't run back inside. That had to count for something. Mrs. Henderson says you live outside town. Eleanor said finally, That must be peaceful. It is, Jacob agreed. Quiet, sometimes too quiet. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding of what it meant to be alone, to be different from what people expected. Eleanor's shyness wasn't weakness, any more than Jacob's preference for solitude was unfriendliness. We're just people who move through the world more quietly than others. I should get back to work, Eleanor said, but she didn't move immediately. Me too, Jacob replied, but he made no move toward his tools. From inside the house came Mrs. Henderson's voice. Eleanor, dear, could you help me with this heavy pot? The spell was broken. Eleanor hurried inside, but not before giving Jacob a small, genuine smile. It was the first time he'd seen her smile, and it transformed her entire face. Over the next few days, Jacob found more and more reasons to visit town. He fixed Mrs. Henderson's roof, replaced a broken window, and repaired the gate that had been hanging crooked for months. Each time, he caught glimpses of Eleanor as she went about her daily tasks. She was a hard worker, despite what Brennan had said. Jacob watched her hang laundry with careful precision, tend Mrs. Henderson's small garden with gentle hands, and helped serve meals to the other boarders with quiet efficiency. She never complained, never demanded attention, but she got things done. The town was slowly taking notice too, though not everyone was kind. Some of the women whispered about her putting on airs when she wore her one good dress to church. Others criticized her soft voice and careful manners. But Jacob also saw the way she helped old Mrs. Cooper carry her groceries, how she always had a kind word for the children who played in the street, and how she never said anything mean about anyone, even those who gossiped about her one evening. As Jacob was loading supplies into his wagon, he overheard two women talking. Outside the dry goods store, "That Eastern girl is trying to find work," one said. "Mrs. Henderson can't keep her forever." "Who'd hire her?" the other replied. "She's too frail for real work." Jacob felt his anger rising again. These people had no idea what they were talking about. Eleanor might be quiet, but she wasn't weak. She was just different. And maybe different was exactly what this rough town needed that night. Jacob sat on his porch and made a decision. He wasn't good with words, and he sure wasn't good with courting, but he knew right from wrong. Eleanor deserved better than the treatment she was getting. And if nobody else was going to help her, then he would. He might not be able to give her much. His homestead was simple, his conversation limited, and his heart still bore the scars of losing Mary. But he could offer her respect, protection, and maybe, in time, something more. The question was whether a gentlewoman from Boston could ever see past his rough exterior to the man underneath. As the stars came out over the prairie, Jacob began planning how to approach Eleanor without scaring her away. It wouldn't be easy, but then again, nothing worthwhile ever was. The first snow came early that year, falling thick and heavy in October when the leaves were still clinging to the trees. Eleanor watched from the boarding house window as the white flakes covered Cedar Falls like a blanket. Back in Boston, snow had always seemed pretty and clean. Here it felt dangerous somehow, like nature was showing everyone who was really in charge. Mrs. Henderson stood beside her, worry lines creasing her forehead. "This doesn't look good," she murmured. "When winter comes this early and this hard, it usually means trouble." She was right. Within a week, the temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in the basins. The wind howled through the town like a living thing, rattling windows and doors. People hurried from building to building with their heads down, scarves wrapped tight around their faces. Then came the sickness. It started with little Annie Fletcher, the blacksmith's daughter. One day she was running around the schoolyard. The next she was burning with fever and struggling to breathe. Dr. Patterson took one look at her swollen throat and shook his head grimly. "Diphtheria," he announced to her parents. "We need to quarantine the house immediately." The word spread through town like wildfire. Diphtheria was a killer, especially of children. Within days, 3 more families were showing the telltale signs: the fever, the terrible cough, the gray coating in the throat that made it hard to swallow. People began staying indoors, afraid to go near the infected houses. The general store saw fewer customers each day. Even the saloon, usually full of noise and laughter, grew quiet. Fear hung over Cedar Falls like a dark cloud. Eleanor heard the news from Mrs. Henderson, who had been asked to help coordinate care for the sick families. The older woman was pacing the kitchen, her hands wringing her apron. "Dr. Patterson is overwhelmed," Mrs. Henderson said. "He's asking for volunteers to help nurse the sick, but—" She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "But what?" Eleanor asked softly. "Most folks are too scared. Can't blame them, really. Diphtheria doesn't care. If you're young or old, rich or poor, it takes whoever it wants." Eleanor felt something stir inside her chest. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of certainty. She'd spent weeks feeling useless, like a burden on Mrs. Henderson's kindness. Here was a chance to actually help, to prove that she was more than just a timid girl from the East. "I'll do it," she said quietly. Mrs. Henderson stopped pacing and stared at her. "Eleanor, child, you don't understand what you're saying. It's disease. It could kill you." "People are suffering," Eleanor replied, her voice growing stronger. "I can't just sit here doing nothing when children are sick." That afternoon, Eleanor walked to Dr. Patterson's office. The usually busy street was nearly empty, with only a few brave souls hurrying about their business. The doctor looked exhausted when she knocked on his door, his hair disheveled and his shirt stained with medicines. "Miss Whitmore? What can I do for you?" "I've come to volunteer," Eleanor said simply. "Mrs. Henderson told me you need help with the sick families." Dr. Patterson studied her face carefully. "This isn't like tending a headache or a scraped knee. Miss Diphtheria is deadly serious. Some of these children," he shook his head. "I can't guarantee your safety." "I understand," Eleanor said. "But I still want to help." The doctor's shoulders sagged with relief. "God bless you, child. I won't lie, I need all the help I can get." Eleanor's first stop was the Fletcher house, where little Annie lay pale and still in her small bed. The child's mother, Catherine Fletcher, looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red with crying and worry. "Oh, miss, you shouldn't be here," Catherine said, when Eleanor appeared at the door with a basket of supplies. "It's too dangerous. Let me help," Eleanor said gently. "You need rest if you're going to take care of Annie." Calm voice seemed to reassure Catherine. Over the next few hours, Eleanor proved herself in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. She had gentle hands that could coax medicine down a sick child's throat. Her quiet voice seemed to soothe fevered minds. And most importantly, she wasn't afraid. Word spread quickly that the quiet girl from Boston was nursing the sick. Some people thought she was brave. Others whispered that she was foolish, throwing her life away for people who had shown her nothing but coldness. Jacob heard the news when he came to town for supplies. Pete Williams mentioned it casually while Jacob was loading his wagon. "Mail-order bride's gone and lost her mind," Pete said, shaking his head. "She's nursing the diphtheria families. Brennan was right about her. She's too soft in the head for frontier life." Jacob felt his hands tighten on the rope he was tying. "What do you mean nursing the sick? Going house to house, tending to the children?" "Doc Patterson's got her running all over town. She's going to catch it herself and die, mark my words." Jacob finished loading his supplies in silence, but his mind was racing. Eleanor was risking her life for people who had treated her poorly. Wasn't weakness, that was courage of the highest kind. Over the next few days, Jacob found himself making more trips to town than usual, always carrying supplies that might be useful for the sick families. He never approached the quarantined houses directly, but he left baskets of food, clean linens, and medicines where Eleanor would find them. She always found them. And somehow, she always knew they came from him. One evening, as Jacob was leaving, another basket by the Miller family's gate, he heard a soft voice behind him. "Thank you." He turned to see Eleanor standing in the shadows by the house. Even in the dim light, he could see how tired she looked. Her dress was wrinkled, her hair was coming loose from its pins, and there were dark circles under her eyes. But there was something different about her too, a strength in her posture that hadn't been there before. "How are they?" Jacob asked, nodding toward the house. "Tommy's fever broke this morning," Eleanor said, and Jacob could hear the smile in her voice even though he couldn't see it clearly. His mother cried with relief. It was the first time I've seen her smile in days. They stood there in comfortable silence for a moment. Around them, the town was quiet, except for the wind whistling. "Through the buildings? Folks think you're crazy for doing this," Jacob said finally. Eleanor was quiet for so long that Jacob thought she might not answer. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "Back home, people always said I was too sensitive, too soft for the real world. Maybe they were right about some things. But watching these families suffer, I couldn't just hide and hope it would all go away. These children need someone to care for them, even after how this town treated you." Eleanor looked up at him then, and even in the darkness, her eyes seemed to shine, especially because of how they treated me. "I know what it feels like to be unwanted, to have people look at you like you don't matter. No child should feel that way, especially when they're sick and scared." Jacob felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't the timid girl who had stepped off the stagecoach weeks ago. This was a woman who had found her purpose, her strength. She'd been tested by hardship and come out stronger. "You should get some rest," he said gently. "You look ready to fall over." Eleanor laughed softly, a sound that made Jacob's heart skip. Mrs. Henderson says the same thing. But there's still so much to do. The sick will still be there tomorrow. You won't be any help to them if you collapse. She nodded reluctantly. You're probably right. Tommy's mother can watch him tonight. His fever's been down for hours now. As they walked together toward the boarding house, Jacob marveled at the change in Eleanor. She moved with quiet confidence now, no longer looking like she expected the world to collapse around her at any moment. The crisis had revealed something in her that even she hadn't known was there. Jacob, Eleanor said as they reached Mrs. Henderson's front steps. Yes. Why do you help? The supplies, I mean, could catch the sickness too. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, searching for the right words. Because you're doing something important, he said finally. And important things shouldn't be done alone. Eleanor smiled then, the first real smile Jacob had seen from her since that day in the store. It lit up her whole face and made her look beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fancy dresses or careful manners. Thank you, she said simply. For everything. As Jacob watched her disappear into the house, he realized something had changed for him too. Eleanor wasn't just the rejected bride he felt sorry for anymore. She was becoming someone he deeply respected, and maybe something more than that. By December, the diphtheria outbreak had finally passed. The last quarantine signs were taken down, and Cedar Falls slowly returned to normal life. But something fundamental had changed in how people saw Eleanor Whitmore. Catherine Fletcher was the first to speak up publicly about Eleanor's care. Standing in the middle of Brennan's store, with half the town listening, she told anyone who would hear about how Eleanor had sat by Annie's bedside for 3 straight days when the fever was at its worst. That girl saved my daughter's life, Catherine declared, her voice shaking with emotion. When Annie couldn't breathe, when I thought we were going to lose her, Eleanor knew exactly what to do. She kept cool cloths on Annie's forehead, got medicine down her throat when she was too weak to swallow, and sang to her when the coughing fits got bad. Other families began sharing their own stories. Tom Miller talked about how Eleanor had stayed, awake all night when his son's temperature spiked, never leaving the boy's side until the crisis passed. Old Mrs. Cooper mentioned how Eleanor had cleaned her house and cooked meals when the sickness left her too weak to care for herself. Never asked for a penny, Mrs. Cooper added. Just showed up every day with soup and a smile, making sure I had everything I needed. Even Dr. Patterson praised Eleanor's work when people asked him about the outbreak. Miss Whitmore has natural healing instincts, he'd told anyone who would listen. She understands that sometimes the best medicine is simply showing people they're not alone in their suffering. The change in how people treated Eleanor was gradual, but unmistakable. Women who had whispered about her behind her back now nodded politely when they passed her on the street. Men who had laughed at Thomas Brennan's rejection now tipped their hats respectfully. Children who had stared at her like she was some strange creature from the East now waved and called out greetings. But the person most affected by Eleanor's transformation was Jacob Morrison. He found himself looking for excuses to come to town more often, always timing his visits for when Eleanor might be running errands or helping Mrs. Henderson with shopping. What started as awkward nods and brief conversations slowly grew into longer talks on Mrs. Henderson's front porch. Jacob discovered that Eleanor was far more interesting than her quiet demeanor suggested. She had read more books than anyone else in Cedar Falls, and she could discuss everything from poetry to politics with surprising insight. She listened to his stories about homestead life with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about farming and livestock that showed she was really paying attention. I've been thinking about getting some chickens, Eleanor mentioned one afternoon as they sat watching the winter sunset paint the sky orange and pink. Mrs. Henderson says fresh eggs would be good for the boarding house, and I'd like to contribute more to my keep. Chickens are good animals to start with, Jacob agreed. Not too much trouble, and they're practical. I could help you pick out some good laying hens when spring comes. Eleanor turned to look at him, her green eyes bright with interest. Would you really? Don't know anything about choosing livestock. Of course I would, Jacob said, feeling warmth spread through his chest at her smile. My Mary always said I had a good eye for chickens. It was the first time Jacob had mentioned his late wife to Eleanor, and he watched her face carefully to see how she would react. Some women got uncomfortable when widowers talked about their first wives, but Eleanor just nodded with understanding. "Ch, must have been a wonderful woman," Eleanor said softly. "Mrs. Henderson told me a little about her. I'm sorry for your loss." "She was good people," Jacob replied. "Would have liked you, I think. Mary always said the measure of a person wasn't how loud they could shout, but how much kindness they could show when nobody was watching." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider his words. "I used to think my family was right about me being too soft for the world, but taking care of the sick families. It made me realize that maybe being gentle isn't the same thing as being weak." "It's not," Jacob said firmly. "What you did during the epidemic that took more courage than most folks will show in their whole lives." Their conversations became the highlight of Jacob's week. He began bringing small gifts when he visited, wildflowers he'd found growing near his creek, fresh eggs from his best hens, or books he thought she might enjoy. Eleanor always accepted these offerings with genuine pleasure, never acting like they were too simple or humble. One snowy evening in January, Jacob arrived to find Eleanor sitting alone on the porch despite the cold. She was wrapped in a thick shawl, but her face looked troubled.
Oh.
"Everything all right?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "I got a letter from my family today," she finally said. "My sister wrote to tell me I should come home. She says I've proven my point about being independent, and now it's time to stop this foolishness and return to proper society." Jacob felt his stomach drop. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing yet. I've been sitting here trying to figure out what I want to say." Eleanor pulled the shawl tighter around herself. "The thing is, I don't think I want to go back. Cedar Falls is starting to feel like home." Relief flooded through Jacob, though he tried not to show it too obviously. "What's keeping you here?" Eleanor was quiet for so long that Jacob thought she might not answer. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful and a little sad. "Back in Boston, I always felt like I was trying to be someone I wasn't. My family wanted me to be more outgoing, more assertive, more like my sister, made me feel like there was something wrong with who I naturally was. But here," she paused, searching for the right words. "Here I've learned that I can be useful just as I am. I don't have to change my whole personality to matter." "You matter," Jacob said quietly. "More than you know." Eleanor turned to look at him, and something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of feelings that had been growing for months. Jacob felt his heart start beating faster. "Lenore," he began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. He'd never been good with words, especially when it came to matters of the heart. "Yes," she prompted gently. That is, ... Jacob took a deep breath and tried again. "Would you mind if I came calling on you? Properly, I mean? With intentions?" Eleanor's face lit up with the most beautiful smile Jacob had ever seen. "I'd like that very much." From that night forward, their relationship changed from friendship to something deeper. Jacob began visiting Eleanor twice a week, always bringing Mrs. Henderson a small gift as well, to show his respect for her role as Eleanor's protector. The older woman clearly approved of the match, often finding excuses to leave them alone on the porch for longer conversations. Jacob told Eleanor about his dreams for expanding his homestead, maybe raising cattle along with crops. Eleanor shared her thoughts about possibly training formally as a nurse, building on the skills she'd discovered during the epidemic. They talked about books they'd read, places they'd like to see, and the simple pleasures of frontier life. "Never thought I'd say this," Eleanor confessed one evening as they watched stars appear in the clear winter sky, "but I love how quiet it is here. In Boston, there was always noise, carriages, people shouting, machinery. Here, you can actually hear yourself think." "Gets lonely sometimes," Jacob admitted, "especially in winter, when you can go days without seeing another soul." "But that's different from being alone in a crowd," Eleanor said. "I was lonely in Boston, surrounded by people who thought they knew what was best for me. Here, even when I'm by myself, I feel ... peaceful." Jacob understood exactly what she meant. For the first time since Mary's death, he felt like he had someone who truly understood him, Eleanor didn't try to change him or make him more sociable. She seemed to appreciate his quiet strength the same way he had come to value her gentle wisdom, as winter slowly gave way to spring. Jacob began thinking seriously about asking Eleanor to marry him. But he wanted to be sure she was choosing him. For the right reasons, not just because she felt grateful for his kindness or because she needed security. Eleanor deserved a love that celebrated who she was, not a marriage of convenience. The test would come sooner than either of them expected. In a way that would force Eleanor to choose between her past and her future. Spring arrived in Cedar Falls, with a burst of wildflowers and warm sunshine that melted the last of the winter snow. Eleanor stood in Mrs. Henderson's garden, planting seeds for vegetables that would feed the boarding house through the summer. Her hands were dirty, her simple dress was practical rather than pretty, and she had never felt more content in her life. 6 months ago, she had been a scared girl from Boston, rejected and humiliated in front of the whole town. Now she was someone people respected, someone who belonged. The transformation still amazed her sometimes when she caught her reflection in the mirror. She was just finishing with the tomato seeds when she heard the familiar jingle of the stagecoach arriving. Eleanor barely looked up from her work anymore. When travelers came to town, but this time was different. This time someone was looking for her. Eleanor Whitmore. She turned at the sound of her name being called and felt her heart sink. Walking toward her across the dusty street was Thomas Brennan, but he looked nothing like the man who had rejected her so cruelly months before. His clothes were finer. Now his hair perfectly groomed, and he wore the confident smile of a man who expected to get what he wanted. "There you are," Thomas said, as he approached the garden gate. "I've been looking all over town for you." Eleanor stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. "Mr. Brennan, I'm surprised to see you." "I've been away on business," Thomas explained, his eyes taking in her appearance with what looked like approval. "Expanding my operations to 3 more towns. It's very profitable ventures. But I kept thinking about you, Eleanor, about the mistake I made." Eleanor said nothing, just waited for him to continue. She had learned the value of silence during her months. "In Cedar Falls, you look different," Thomas said, stepping closer to the gate. "Stronger somehow, more confident. I heard about what you did during the epidemic. Very impressive." "I did what needed doing," Eleanor replied simply. Thomas nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. That's the kind of practical thinking a successful businessman needs in a wife. I was wrong about you, Eleanor. I can see that now." Eleanor felt a strange calm settle over her. 6 months ago, these words would have meant everything to her. Thomas Brennan, apologizing, admitting he was wrong, wanting her back. It should have felt like vindication. Instead, she just felt ... nothing. "What are you saying, Mr. Brennan?" "I'm saying I want to renew my offer of marriage," Thomas declared. "I've done very well for myself these past months. I can offer you a fine house, nice clothes, servants to do the hard work. You'd be the wife of one of the most successful merchants in the territory." A small crowd was beginning to gather, drawn by the sound of raised voices. Eleanor could see curious faces peering out from nearby shops and houses. Once again, Thomas was making a public spectacle of her, though this time with very different intentions. "I can give you everything a woman could want," Thomas continued, his voice growing louder as he noticed his audience. "Security, status, respect. We'll never have to work in a garden or tend sick people again. You can be a proper lady." Eleanor looked down at her dirty hands, then back at Thomas's expectant face. "And what would you get out of this arrangement?" "Mr. Brennan, wife who's proven she can handle frontier challenges. Someone practical and capable. We'd make a good team, Eleanor." The word practical stung more than any of his earlier insults. Thomas wasn't offering her love or even genuine companionship. He was offering her a business arrangement based on what he'd seen of her usefulness. "I appreciate your offer, Eleanor," said quietly, "but I must decline." Thomas's confident smile faltered. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "I said no, thank you." Eleanor's voice was calm and clear, carrying easily to the gathered crowd. "I'm not interested in marrying you, Mr. Brennan." "But this is everything you wanted," Thomas sputtered. "When you came here, you were looking for a husband for security. I'm offering you both." Eleanor shook her head slowly. I was looking for those things. You're right. But I've learned something important these past months. I've learned the difference between being wanted and being valued. What's that supposed to mean? You want me now because you think I'll be useful to you? When I first arrived, you rejected me because you thought I wouldn't be useful enough. Either way, it's not really about me as a person, is it? It's about what I can do for you. Thomas's face was growing red with embarrassment and frustration. You're being ridiculous, Eleanor. This is a generous offer, more generous than someone in your position has any right to expect. My position? Eleanor's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it now. And what position is that exactly? You're a spinster with no family support, no money, and no prospects. I'm offering to overlook all of that and make you respectable. The cruelty in his words was the same as it had been 6 months ago, but this time, Eleanor didn't flinch. She had found her strength, and it came from knowing her own worth. I have learned my worth, Mr. Brennan, she said clearly, and it cannot be measured by your approval or disapproval. A murmur of appreciation ran through the crowd. Eleanor could see some of the women nodding in approval, and more than a few of the men looked impressed by her dignity. You'll regret this, Thomas said angrily. When winter comes and you're still scraping by at that boarding house, you'll wish you'd taken my offer.
That's...
Eleanor replied. But I'd rather scrape by with my self-respect intact than live comfortably knowing I'd settled for being seen as merely useful. Thomas opened his mouth to argue further, but a deep voice interrupted him. I think the lady has made herself clear. Everyone turned to see Jacob Morrison stepping out from behind his wagon. Eleanor's heart leaped at the sight of him. She hadn't known he was in town, but she was grateful for his presence now. This doesn't concern you, Morrison, Thomas snapped. When someone's bothering Miss Eleanor, it concerns me, Jacob replied calmly. His voice was quiet, but there was something in his tone that made Thomas take a step back. Jacob walked over to stand beside the garden gate, not quite touching Eleanor, but close enough that his support was unmistakable. Eleanor's given you her answer, Brennan. Seems like it's time to accept it and move on. Thomas looked back and forth between Jacob and Eleanor, and understanding dawned on his face. I see what this is about. You've got yourself a new suitor. Someone who doesn't mind taking second-hand goods. Jacob's hands clenched into fists, but before he could respond, Eleanor stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, but carried clearly to every person watching. Mr. Brennan, I want to thank you for something, she said. Your rejection 6 months ago was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to discover who I really am, not who others expect me to be. I've learned that I'm stronger than I thought, kinder than I knew, and worth more than I ever imagined. She paused, looking directly into Thomas's eyes. I've also learned that true strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room or the most demanding presence. Sometimes it's about being the steady hand that holds others up when they're falling. Sometimes it's about showing grace under pressure, and sometimes it's about knowing when to say no. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Thank you, Mr. Brennan, for showing me what I don't want in a marriage. I don't want to be seen as useful. I don't want to be valued for what I can provide rather than who I am. And I certainly don't want to spend my life with someone who sees kindness as weakness. Eleanor turned to Jacob then, her face soft with love and certainty. I want to be with someone who appreciates my gentle nature without expecting me to change. It's someone who sees my quiet strength as an asset, not a liability. Someone who values my heart as much as my hands. Jacob's face broke into the biggest smile Eleanor had ever seen from him. Without a word, he opened the garden gate and stepped inside. Taking Eleanor's dirt-stained hands in his work-roughened ones, "Eleanor Whitmore," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "Yes, I will." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Thomas Brennan stood there for a moment, his face red with humiliation, before stalking away without another word. As Jacob pulled Eleanor into his arms for their first kiss, she thought, about the scared girl who had stepped off the stagecoach all those months ago? That girl had been looking for someone to rescue her, to give her a place in the world. But Eleanor had learned something better. She had rescued herself. The wedding took place a month later in the small church at the center of town. Half of Cedar Falls attended, including all the families Eleanor had nursed through the epidemic. Mrs. Henderson cried happy tears as she watched Eleanor walk down the aisle in a simple but beautiful dress made by the town's seamstress. As they exchanged vows, Eleanor's voice rang clear and strong. She was no longer the timid bride who had been rejected for being too gentle. She was a woman who knew her worth, who had found her strength, and who had chosen love based on mutual respect and understanding. Years later, people in Cedar Falls would still talk about Eleanor Morrison, how she became the town's most trusted healer, how her homestead with Jacob became a place of refuge for anyone in need, and how she proved that true worth couldn't be measured by how loud you spoke or how tough you appeared.